My name is Sam Greene. I'm a professor of Russian politics at King's College London and run the Democratic Resilience Program at CEPA. An honor to be back at the forum with you, Jana, and with everybody in the room. I've commented a couple times that it feels to me like going back to pre-war Moscow, so it's always good to see people that I don't otherwise get to see. Also very good to be on this panel. Everybody I think on this panel is pretty well known to everybody in this room. Bios are up on the slides, and so I'm not going to spend time going through that. We've been talking about fear, right, from a number of angles today, and it strikes me that the discussions of fear have really hit on an important aspect of it, which is the ambivalence of fear, right? That fear acts on us in different ways, and it was said in the first panel about the war itself, right? That fear is a poor guide, but also we're not well guided when we live without fear, right? When we ignore the threats that exist in our lives, right? So, we've talked about the ways in which fear can disorient people and the way in which it can focus people's attention. We're all familiar with the idea of sort of the fight or flight response that people have when they encounter fear. There's a third F in that category, which is freeze, right? We've talked about also the ways in which this war and the threats that we're facing in various aspects of the world now can also cause us simply to be paralyzed, right? And there's a physiological aspect to that process. There's just something that goes on in our brains and our limbic systems that makes us react in a certain way. But there's also a social process as part of that we engage, we look to see what others around us are doing, and that shapes what we do, but also what we do then shapes what other people around us do. So this has been a long-winded introduction to what I think is an excellent panel, an excellent group of people today who have dealt with the various aspects of that fight, flight, or freeze response to fear in different contexts, different political contexts, different professional contexts, different social contexts. And so that's what we're going to try to talk about now. But everybody in this room, I think, has also dealt with this and is dealing with this in one way or another. So I'm going to try to get as many people as we can involved in the conversation, both here in the room and online. And somebody will tell me when I'm running out of time and I have to bring this to a close. Franak, sorry, there you are. If I can start with you. 4 years ago, almost exactly 4 years ago, Belarusians from all parts of society displayed a degree of fearlessness that I think took many people outside Belarus by surprise, maybe even took some people within Belarus by surprise, certainly took Lukashenko's regime by surprise, took Moscow by surprise. Thousands of people, however, paid a pretty high price and continue to pay a pretty high price for that fearlessness. Has fear returned to Belarus, or is the fearlessness still there?
Thank you so much. Thanks for your question. First of all, it didn't start in 2020 for us. Of course, it was a very important moment for Belarusian national building. This 2020 and 2022, it also strengthens Belarusian identity. Belarusians realize that they're not the same as the regime. And in 2022, they realized that Belarusians are not Russians. And this was a very important moment and point of non-return for our society and country. And right now, yes, we are living in fear. We are living in repression, but it doesn't mean that people are giving up, because these institutions, these organizations, civil society groups, they are still working, maybe in different mood, in different format, many underground, but they are preparing for the new window of opportunity. And I must say that it didn't start in 2020 also. Given an example of Boris Nemtsov, because Boris Nemtsov was not only freedom fighter for Russia, but also freedom fighter for Belarus. And he was in Belarus many times. He was in Belarus persona non grata. And he was the one who said that Belarus is a European country, will become democracy and free independent nation and become an example for Russia. And I would like to quote him, since it's a Boris Nemtsov Forum, right? He said, being in Minsk, I believe that Belarus has a better chance of becoming a free, democratic European country than Russia. First, because Belarus does not have imperial complex. Second, you're absolutely at the heart of Europe. Third, you do not have the Caucasus. And besides that, you're an educated people and Europe is very close to you. In short, if you succeed, then we will succeed too. And this is what we also see in 2020 when Belarusian protests, which caught by surprise many nations and Lukashenko's regime, but also it caught by surprise Putin, who did not expect such a self-organization. But it also inspired, in some way, people in Russia. And I remember so big attention from Russian media, from Russian societal groups, protests in Khabarovsk when people brought Belarusian flags to these protests. It was this moment when we saw when society in Belarus can not only bring changes in Belarus itself, but also can spark changes in Russia. And I think it didn't change since then. And when moment of opportunity will come, Belarusian change can help to change Russia too. And no fear, no repression will stop this change.
Thank you. We'll come back to that. But since you brought up Russia, Irina, if I can turn to you. We've touched on this a little bit already in some of the discussions about the responsibility that Russian citizens bear, right? Both those inside Russia and those outside Russia. But that segment of Russian society that has opposed the war and that continues to oppose Putin stands accused, right, including in today's conversation, to a certain degree, of allowing themselves to be demobilized by fear, right? Of choosing to allow that fear to keep them off the streets or to push them into exile and to do things other than to stop the war and to bring down Putin. Are those accusations, in your view, fair?
Thank you so much. I prefer to speak Russian. Sorry. Я тут все-таки историк, поэтому мне придется сказать несколько слов, так сказать, со своей точки зрения. Тем более я хочу сказать, что исторические нарративы играют в этой войне огромную роль, как просто ни в каком другом конфликте, потому что ими оперирует пропаганда, потому что эти исторические нарративы из полемики журнальной превратились во фронтовую, страшную фронтовую линию, в страшную войну. Вот. И если говорить вот именно о страхе сегодня, то, конечно, надо сказать, что у страха длинный шаг и очень длинное эхо. И, собственно говоря, мы же в мемориале этим и занимались все эти годы. Мы все-таки пытались, значит, вот тем, что в нашей, так сказать, образовательной просветительской работе, все-таки это было главное — избавить людей от страха, так сказать, перед прошлым. И мы видели, как это крепко сидит, невероятно, 2 поколения, 3 поколения, и как это быстро, история не повторяется, но поведение людей в условиях репрессий, давления и диктатуры, модели поведения очень повторяются к нашему, на самом деле, к нашему ужасу. Вообще весь наш архив, свидетельства, вот нас часто спрашивают, что такое ваш архив. Наш архив — свидетельство, с одной стороны, страха, с другой стороны, сопротивления. И очень яркое свидетельство, потому что, значит, вот вы знаете этот символ. Вот эти фотографии есть на самом деле почти в каждой семье. Это вырезанные лица или закрашенные лица на фотографиях. И это такое абсолютно наглядное свидетельство и картинка страха. И дальше мы будем говорить, сегодня будут говорить о культуре, будут говорить о, так сказать, о цензуре. Что это, собственно говоря? Это вот закрашивание фамилий режиссеров, вырезание там актеров и так далее, и так далее. Значит, страх приводит к тому, что, значит, ну, во-первых, мы все понимаем эти последствия. Во-первых, атомизация общества и недоверие совершенно, страх перед другим, и самые разные приспособленчество, доносительство. Это все нормализация такого, так сказать, ужаса. Это все свидетельство и, так сказать, последствия страха. И бороться с этим чрезвычайно трудно. И бороться с этим можно на самом деле только снятием как, так сказать, борется со страхом на самом-то деле по-настоящему, это снятием вот этого государственного страшного давления, террора и насилия. И вот все события, которых сейчас, и вот то, о чем мы говорили сейчас про Белоруссию, и то, как мы вспоминали конец 80-х, и то, как мы вспоминали реакцию людей, вот Жанна говорила вначале о подписях, которые собирал Борис Немцов, и о протесте против Чеченской войны. Это все были свидетельства того, что страх отступил у людей, что страх перед государством и перед государственным насилием отступил. Но это очень сложная вещь. Люди чувствуют, это иногда даже как-то трудно сказать, они это почти физически ощущают, простите меня за эту нехорошую цитату, что верхи не могут, а низы не хотят. Значит, старшее поколение помнит, значит, откуда взялась эта цитата. Но она, к сожалению, действительно очень, очень реалистична. И когда люди вот это вот, так сказать, чувствуют, что они больше не могут, а у верхов нету все-таки сил, а самое главное убеждения, значит, и убежденности, то тогда, так сказать, действует этот массовый протест. И мы его видели в конце 80-х годов. И самое главное, что это был фактически мирный протест. Это было очень важно, потому что мирный протест как раз снимает страх. Когда люди выходят на улицы, значит, и они вот так вот мирным образом побеждают эту власть, то это очень сильное, так сказать, лекарство против страха. И знаете, я скажу такую вещь. Все-таки что-то оптимистическое, так сказать, надо говорить. Что шанс, потому что когда я слышу, что Россия обречена, что всегда был страх, что этот страх всегда, так сказать, сидит, он правда сидит, он очень глубокий. Но мы увидели, буквально через 10 лет, когда мы начали наш школьный конкурс в мемориале исторический, мы его ровно начали в 99 году, мы увидели, это был очень оптимистический проект, потому что мы вдруг увидели у этих, так сказать, у этого поколения, получается, так сказать, 9 лет, да, такого без выросшего, в общем, без такого с другими страхами, но без страха перед государственным террором и государственной машиной, что это свободное поколение. Я помню, что мы просто поражались, что они пишут, а я пошла в ФСБ местное и говорю, вы дайте мне списки тех, кто воевал в Чечне. Вы мне дайте списки, я хочу с этими людьми поговорить. А то мне говорят, что никаких в военкомате, мне говорят, никаких мы тебе списков не дадим. А я вот пойду. Значит, и это было очень часто. И это такое, так сказать, была такая, так сказать, надежда на то, что... И мы увидели, к большому сожалению, чем, так сказать, режим становился все более, так сказать, репрессивным и так далее, тем, конечно, возвращался страх. Но я хочу сказать еще последнюю такую в этом раунде вещь, что влияет, конечно, на, так сказать, протест. Две главные основные вещи. Это осознание больших групп людей, что они действительно так жить не могут, и это осознание должно быть очень таким, так сказать, сильным. А с другой стороны, все-таки ощущение того, что если мы выйдем на протест, мы чего-то достигнем. Потому что если бывает и другой протест, бывает протест совершенного отчаяния и гнева от того, что человек все равно, так сказать, вот я знаю, что это ничем не кончится, но я все равно не могу, я должен протестовать. Вот белую розу упоминали, значит, вчера. Или, конечно, Навальный такой пример. Эти люди, или восстание в Варшавском гетто, эти люди остаются в истории. Этих примеров мало. Немцов был такой человек. Этих людей мало, и они остаются как символы в истории. Но что происходит сейчас в России, это не демобилизация, это деморализация общества. Потому что это не совсем правильное слово демобилизация, это деморализация. Это то, что все-таки мы знаем, что, конечно, тут нет Лёвы Гудкова, и я не такой пессимист, как он, значит, хотя он часто оказывается прав в своих социальных прогнозах. Но все-таки мы видим, что критически настроенная часть общества и готовая все-таки к протесту, она небольшая, и она остается, в общем, небольшой. И все-таки основная масса населения под влиянием страха, давления, но не только, под влиянием приспособленчества и нормализации этой жизни, и страхи эти, они как бы войны не касаются. В этом вот все дело. Ну вот, простите, немножко затянула.
Sorry, we'll come back to the question about that larger portion of Russian society. But Sergei, if I can turn to you, I asked Irina whether the accusations of allowing fear to take over were fair when addressed to Russians. We have heard some of these accusations today addressed to Western leaders, from Joe Biden to Olaf Scholz to others. Certainly not everybody, but to many, and in many ways to the most powerful. And so my question for you is whether those accusations are fair.
Yeah. Thank you. And being a politician on a panel on fair and resistance, it's very difficult for me to kind of grasp and to find a way and access to the discussion. And I was thinking, why is it this way? Probably because fear is not a political concept. But fear is number one, is a political instrument by many, and it's very often a political context in which policymakers have to behave. I don't think that, speaking of fear is something that we should taboo. I mean, people do have fear, they do see risks, and this is something, when we're talking about people here in Germany and in Europe, it is a fear of escalation, fear of nuclear war, etc., etc. I don't think it would be useful to be dismissive about this sentiment. I think that the true political leadership is not about forbidding people to be fearful. It's about rationalizing and controlling the consequences of fear in politics, in population, in country. And this is where I think the issue, that I have issues with some of the leaders that we have. I do have openly an issue with some of the leaders in Germany, and openly sometimes criticize the chancellor, who I think takes this fear sometimes as a political instrument, sometimes as too much of a guiding political context. I am concerned about the position of President Biden on issues, for example, of lifting the limitations of use of certain arms sales. In fact, the resolution on Ukraine 2 weeks ago that we initiated and that I wrote explicitly says that European Parliament is for lifting the limitations. However, it should not be a position of kind of a highbrow, this fear is totally irrational. I think this is the balance that when I talk also to some people, also to some representatives of Russian opposition, etc., they are very dismissive regarding the Westerners who have this fear. I think it's normal. And if you look at the history of Germany, the country that was on the border basically between the two blocks, when I talk to people both in West and East who they have a recollection on really knowing that they would be the field of the World War III if something happens. These are the things that are triggered, and these things are not, in that sense, irrational. They are there. They are facts. And the question is how to deal with that. And this is where I think the leadership failure very often happens. On the one hand, taking the risks seriously. And I do think it is important that a leadership, whether in Berlin or Washington, says, yes, there is a risk of nuclear escalation. Yes, this is the fact. But the question is, what conclusions do we draw from that? And are these conclusions guided by, by this fear, or trying to make a step further and say, yes, this fear is there. how do we deal with this in a rational way? And this is, I think, where we still have some deficits. I think that our foreign minister, my party basically, has also gone a long way here, and confronting one's own fear is probably something that we need more in politics, whether in the White House or in the Chancellery, without being reckless. Without being reckless. This is not what it is about. But having restrictions on use of arms against legitimate Russian targets, for example, which is covered by international law, is is something where we are guided by fear more than by rational political leadership.
Thank you. I'm going to come back in a bit, I think, to that borderline between recklessness and responsibility. But you mentioned that Germany spent much of the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, seeing itself as the land on which that great power war could be fought in Europe. Ukraine, of course, Andreas, is the land in which that is being fought at the moment, if only by one side in that equation. But Ukrainians within that context of the war, and again, we've heard that this morning, are often praised for having an almost metaphysical level of fearlessness and preparedness to continue resistance to really overwhelming Russian aggression. You and I are both social scientists. We don't necessarily believe in metaphysics as a cause of human outcomes. So, as somebody who has spent your career studying Ukrainian society, how do you explain that level of fearlessness?
First, I would perhaps start with something counterintuitively, that it may be not actually so much related to Ukraine itself, but to the war itself, and that there's a German philosophical expression about the normative power of the factual. So we are sitting here, we're discussing about war, and most people, they know war from the television, from discussions, from art products, from reports, and so on. I think it's a different story if you are actually in the war, and my suspicion is that actually that the very defeatist and pacifist German society, if it ever would actually encounter a factual war, not a war as a matter of discussion or of a movie or something like that, Germans would actually become defenders of their fatherland, because it's very different. You can now say, well, if there's war, I move to another country. It's very different when actually your hometown is being bombed, when your friends are being, mutilated or in prisons and so on. And I remember I lived in Ukraine, the Ukrainian society before 2014. It was a very it was in some ways actually similar to the German society. It was very pacifist. It was Russia was not seen as an enemy. I remember an article by a Ukrainian journalist published in Ukrainska Pravda, who simply compared the opinion polls from the Levada Center about how Russians think about Ukrainians, and from the Kiev Institute of Sociology, how the Ukrainians think about Russians. And the article was called "Мы их любим, они нас нет." We love them, we Ukrainians love the Russians, but they don't love us. So the paradoxical result was that the Ukrainians had, on average, in the opinion polls over 20 years, a better view of the Russians than the Russians about the Ukrainians. So, I remember that. And then comes the war. First the invasion comes, and of course the Ukrainians, unlike the West Europeans, knew very well who these little green men were on Crimea, and they knew very well that what happened in Donbass was not something local. A Russian colleague, many of whom you know, has called this the invasion of the Farsians, not the invasion of the Martians, but of the farcical people, basically appearing in Zakharchenko and Pushilin and who was this other guy from Luhansk. yeah, I mean, these really strange people, some of them Ukrainians, but then Girkin and so on from Russia and so on. And Ukrainians knew very well that this was not an opolchenia, a rebellion or a civil war and so on, that this was something arranged from Moscow. That was the first alienation. And then, of course, the bombs are simply falling. And then I think the second factor that comes in, that apparently there was much more of a Ukrainian nation than many, even of the Ukraine experts, the Western Ukraine experts thought. You know, there was all this talk about coming from Huntington about a cleft country, a divided country. You know, you have these Russian speakers and the Ukrainian speakers, and they were almost two nations actually. And it turns out not two nations. And there were some topics: the Kievan Rus, the Cossack tradition, Shevchenko, the Holodomor, and so on. Hope, you know, if Ukrainians here may add something to this or correct me on this, which were actually uniting both parts of Ukraine, even the most eastern, so to say, Ukrainians. And there was also then something suddenly which came up, that there was a tradition of resisting Russian imperialism going back to the, I don't know, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, to Soviet Russian imperialism. There was, you know, the Cossack tradition, the Ukrainian insurgent army, and so on. There was something to build on, and that came then to the forefront, which was not very present, frankly, before 2014. You know, it was mentioned and it was in the history books. It was, but in my perception, it was not something that was every day in daily life. And then it became a matter, especially after 2022, a matter of everyday daily life. These traditions of resistance. And then the third factor, I think, were the three revolutions: the revolution of 1990 on the granite, the Orange Revolution, and then the Euromaidan Revolution, and then the following decentralization. I think the decentralization reform was a sort of the main outcome then of these three revolutions. And then there was this tradition of self-organization, which then I think was a surprise, as much as the existence of a nation, actually, of a national, common national spirit that would unite these different sort of sub-ethnic groups, you could call them, but which are actually very common. I mean, we Germans, we are a sort of an assembly of different sort of cultures: Protestant, Catholic, East German, West German. Now it has actually become a factor. And so, yeah, I think there was, I mean, Ukraine has certainly certain things that made the Ukrainians, I would still return to my first thesis. There were certain factors in the history and in the culture and that sort of do explain this, but I think the main factor is actually when you experience war, this is actually something very different from discussing war. It simply creates a new world. War, as somebody has changes everything. And, you know, I've also experienced that in my, including private life, that war changes everything. So, and you know, my feeling is actually something similar would happen to many countries if they would actually experience war and not just discuss it as a sort of theoretical concept.
Thank you. Again, lots of threads that we'll pull on, and hopefully the audience will. But before I open it up, Jennifer, you, first of all, thanks to the support of the Kennan Institute for this conference. But you run, right, really one of the most important platforms for the study of Russia, both contemporary and historical. And it's a field, you know, that has certainly in the last 2.5 years been riven by really fundamentally deep emotional, but also conceptual and ideological and methodological fissures in which a lot of us, you know, for whom this is our profession, have really begun to question what the purpose and the mission of our field is. That, of course, brings with it its own, you know, fears and anxieties and difficulties. And I wonder, you know, from your perspective as somebody who brings a lot of these conversations together, has that been an empowering phenomenon in pushing us to think differently about Russia, or has that gotten in the way of us thinking seriously about Russia?
No, thank you. It's a lot of good questions there, and you're right. The Kennan Institute, we are fortunate. For 50 years, we have had a mandate. It's been our mission to focus on Russia studies, and so I don't think, in all honesty, that the past 2.5 years has diminished that in any respect. Can you closer? Is that okay? Sorry. So I don't think the past 2.5 years has, in any meaningful respect, diminished the importance of looking at Russia studies. If I could take your question a little bit, maybe, and I speak here now only from the American perspective, Russia studies in general has seen a decline in the US for decades. I think post-1991, there was this idea that the Russia question was solved, and so a lot of universities in the US have seen declines since 1991 in students enrolled in studying Russian language, wanting to take even courses in Russian history. Back to Irina's point, history is critically important, and there's been a drop-off in that. So I think the cumulative effect of that is you have a generation of people who have been brought up less interested in Russia and now less interested in what's taking place. And so that, I think, getting to some of the words you said, questioning the purpose of the field, is this creating fissures perhaps? I do think that that is a problem in the long term. And so I think reigniting an interest in young people is critical in universities in the US and getting them to want to study the place, study the culture, study the language, because I think without that, you're not meaningfully going to have any transformations in the dialogues that are taking place. Certainly, again, I'm just speaking here between the US and Russia. Maybe to speaking more in the last 2.5 years when you brought up that, yes, we do convene a lot of people. That's one of the things the Kennan Institute does. We bring together both Russians, Ukrainians, other people from other countries as well. And I think maybe one of the positive turns, and this was brought up in some of the discussions this morning, is learning to look at the conflict not just through the Russian lens anymore, right? So much of, again, Russia studies in the US has been everything through the Russian lens and not even allowing the Ukrainian perspective to come out. It's Ukraine understood through the Russian perspective. Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia understood through the Russian perspective. And I think finally, and I don't want to bring up decolonization studies, which is a very controversial topic, in how it's understood, but maybe finally one of the positive benefits of the past 2.5 years is allowing these countries to have their perspective to understand the conflict as well, and not always suffusing it through Russia.
Thanks. Happy to take questions from the room if people have them already. I'm not seeing any hands go up at the moment. I will also turn online in a second. But while you're digesting this and the remnants of your lunch. Franak, I'd like to come back to you because you mentioned that you think when opportunities arise, right, Belarusian society will respond. We've heard in a number of contexts of this conversation, both in terms of Ukrainians and in terms of Russians on the streets in earlier parts of the political resistance there, a sense of being alone, right? And of the difficulty of resisting alone. How can the friends of a free and democratic Belarus help in the future?
I'm trying to look at the situation in Belarus optimistically. First of all, we see that the situation is quite volatile, and Lukashenko's regime is reacting to the situation in Ukraine, to success of Ukraine's army. Kursk operation was a huge blow on Lukashenko because immediately we received so many contacts and calls from Lukashenko's officials who were sleeping since 2020. And suddenly they woke up because they felt, oh, something is happening, perhaps, and they want to be on the good side of the history. And similar situation was happening during Prigozhin's march. Unfortunately, who knows? It ended up as it ended up. So no more Wagner in Belarus, it's a good thing. No more Prigozhin, it's also a good thing. Putin is in place, it's a bad thing. But this process that Prigozhin showed that the situation is volatile and sensitive and reacting to this change, it's quite promising. It means, many of these black swans, they can change the situation very quickly, and no fear can stop it. This feeling of not being alone is crucial. And, it's this revolution, it's like iPhone battery. It can be 5%, it can be 3%, 1%. You create this safe mode, this battery saving mode, and most important, it doesn't switch off. And so you have to charge it, and every meeting, the tweet of solidarity by Sergei, some assistance package or sanction package, thanks Michael, for pushing that. It helps, to get 10% more, 10% more. We are not 100% like in 2020. No, we are still 15, 20%. But there will be sequence of events which will make it 100%, and this will be the moment of opportunity. So you have to charge it constantly. And negativity and the fear, it charges, it's like the heat and freeze, it discharges the battery faster. And that's the biggest problem. So we must not allow this fear, to discharge and kill this iPhone's battery, to the end. So we have to project positivity. We have to show the positive things as well, because this negative news, which the regime generates a lot, arrests, repression, it is not helping. We must show that there are good things that are happening, successes, successful act of resistance, successes of Ukraine also helps. Because repressions, what's different is happening right now. Dictators, they televise repressions, they broadcast repressions. Before, they try to hide it, because they know there will be punishment. Right now, they don't see mechanisms of punishment, and they want these repressions to be everywhere, to show it. Now, when they detain people, they record the video, confessional video, and they put this video on YouTube, and they advertise this video on YouTube, paying money to YouTube. And we blocked already more than 500 videos with YouTube together of such. So we must prevent it, from this amplification of the visual horrors that are taking place. And we must stop this perceptions that to be a villain is a cool thing. Because right now what Lukashenko and Putin feel, it's like the Hollywood for them, To be a villain, it's a cool thing, There are other guys, but we are villains, and we are fighting them. And for some part of the world, it's quite Hollywoodish, entertaining, to see how these villains fighting good guys. And we must stop that. To be villain, stop this perception of the dictatorship. It's not a good thing. And for everyone who consider to join a good side of villains, they must know that joining villains will bring consequences to them.
Okay, I'm going to pick up on that and Sergei, ask you how that looks from where you sit as a politician in Europe. Western governments have a history, particularly the US, but not only, of sometimes, at least rhetorically, encouraging people suffering under imperialism and authoritarianism to resist. And then in some cases not always following through with the support that they need to resist successfully. And we can think about 1956 in Hungary, for example, but we can also think about the accusations that are already flying towards Western politicians of not doing enough to actually create a Ukrainian victory. Right? So from a Western perspective, where's the greater obligation? Is it to press for democratic sovereignty and follow through on those promises? Or is it to keep people safe, first and foremost?
First of all, I wouldn't compare the situation in Ukraine and the situation elsewhere where we are talking about resistance or opposition. And for me personally, there is a difference. Regarding Ukraine, this is an international conflict. This is an aggression against the state. And that's where we are morally obliged and legally enabled to assist. This is different in a situation where we're talking about opposition in some other countries. And I am very careful also in my political work that we don't cross the line towards supporting some covert operations or making too much of how would you say, regime change fantasies in our instruments. This is, by the way, a difference between some of us. I know that Andreas Kubilius is more, for example, outspoken and wants to go, that was the discussion about the report on Russia just last year, wants more to go in that direction. I don't think that this is responsible, and I don't think this is advisable. What we can do is not encourage, but assist people within the limits of what we can, and also not to raise expectations that would be too high. We're not going to bomb Kremlin in order to support Russian opposition. We're not going to march into Belarus in order to support opposition in Belarus. This is not possible, and we don't have a mandate by our voters to do that. We have to be honest about that. But between those very extreme forms of action and doing nothing, there is a lot that can be done and should be done. We have European Endowment of Democracy. We have many other instruments on how to try to support in open and not very open ways in order for financial support. We have sanctions mechanism, etc. And yes, some people cannot hear anymore the resolution here, resolution there. Where is the action? Well, there will be no action. We will not be starting war because we think that the right people are repressed, the good people are repressed in the country. We have to be realistic about that. And yes, it is also about safety of certain people and how to go about it. And from that perspective, I think fear is an important point. I mean, many of the people who are here because of fear. You didn't stay in Russia, and we didn't encourage you to stay in Russia because it's too risky for many to stay in Russia. But you decided to have a productive way of dealing with this fear, not to just close up and do nothing, but to leave the country, and that's where we can assist. We can help people to come out of the country, to be safe here, and to enable them to work. And if anything, I would encourage our government, also in very difficult budgetary times, not to stop supporting those people and those organizations from working here and trying to assist the change and transformation in the country. So let's be realistic. Don't expect too much from the West. And again, Ukraine is a different case, but if you think, it's the same in Turkey. I mean, I was a EU-Turkey chair of the delegation in the European Parliament. It was the same. Opposition people came to us and said, you are writing resolutions, but what, you don't do anything against Erdogan. Well, what can we do? We're not going to bomb Ankara either.
You take that as good news. Irina, you talked about the mass of Russian citizens, right, that have adopted a position regarding this war that most of us would find unsatisfactory, and I want to dig into that a little bit more, right? Depending on whether you take Lev Gudkov's view of things or others, right? This can be described in different ways, right? From outright supporting the war, to simply being afraid to oppose the war, to simply wishing that the war was not really a part of their life and trying to avoid it entirely. Leave aside those, as Lev Gudkov joins us, leaving aside those who actively support the war, genuinely support the war as sort of a lost cause, right, for us. What do you think drives the fear of engagement and the lack of willingness to speak out? Are people afraid of what happens if Russia loses the war? Are they afraid of simply losing normalcy? Are they afraid of repression?
Ну, во-первых, надо сказать, что путинский режим начал же не вчера, а он продолжается же много лет. И когда у людей много лет возникает привычка к несвободе, каждый день все больше и больше и больше и больше. Это на них действует, и это их, безусловно, деморализует. И создает, с одной стороны, привычку к этой несвободе, да, а с другой стороны, ощущение того, ну а что мы можем вообще, что мы можем сделать? Мы же не можем, так сказать, мы же не можем ничего. И сигналы эти, опять я скажу как историк, они были же очень-очень рано. Когда есть прямая связь с установлением памятников Сталину, на самом деле с подчинению, так сказать, этим страхам. Потому что Сталин, это ведь началось очень-очень давно, почти сразу же после прихода Путина к власти. А на самом деле, что бы ни говорили о величии, Сталин – это олицетворение абсолютной власти государства над человеком и массового террора. И если это становится, так сказать, снова частью так сказать, идеологии, то это означает, что люди поддерживают то, что они находятся всецело под властью государства. И это очень, так сказать, мы вот в мемориале же мы все время об этом говорили, это крайне, так сказать, опасный синдром такой, вот такого выбора. И хитрость была в том, что он был постепенный. Вот так сказать, шаг за шагом, ухудшение законов, отнятие свобод и так далее, и так далее, и так далее. И люди даже как-то сами не замечали, как это обычно бывает в повседневной жизни, как они вот так сказать втекают, приспосабливаются к этому всему. Есть и режим, ему не нужно было быть массовым. Этим репрессиям, и вот это такое, мы же часто говорим, постмодернистская такая диктатура, ему не надо было быть уже массовым. Если Сталин действовал массовым террором, и надо себе представить, например, ситуацию, когда в Москве, там, не знаю, во время большого террора арестовывают в один день 10 тысяч человек. Это даже для такого, так сказать, большого города уже, и эти люди исчезают, и никто не знает на самом деле, что с ними происходит. Иногда много лет не знают, что с ними произошло. Это одна вещь. А тут, значит, точечные репрессии, но зато их можно увидеть абсолютно, так сказать, почти в прямом режиме. Можно увидеть, как людей тащат на улице, как их сбивают дубинками, как люди свидетельства оставляют пыток. И вот что самое на самом деле, одно из очень действенных механизмов. Пытки Сталин скрывал. Они были не публичные. И очень часто люди говорят, как у нас в нашей коммунистической стране людей пытают, это же не может быть, никто в этом, так сказать, не признается много лет и так далее. В брежневское время, при всей его отвратительности по отношению к диссидентам, применение вот таких прямых пыток, страшных избиений, и не только, все-таки не было. Мы знаем, так сказать, мучили, и мы знаем, как погиб Стус. Это, безусловно, никто этого не забывает. Но вот такого, я бы сказала, массового, и это же в воздухе носится. И неважно кто. Вчера мы слышали, мы знаем всю эту страшную историю про 15-летнего мальчика. Пожилые женщины, 70-летние люди, университетские профессора. Не имеет значения кто. Если, так сказать, будете против нас, то будете избиты, изнасилованы и как угодно. И это, конечно же, на людей действует, и это усиливается, и это на людей действует, конечно, очень страшным образом. Но мы видим, на самом деле, что как только, что, конечно, есть люди, безусловно, с этим не согласные, и как только есть возможность, когда им кажется, что все-таки этот страх отступил, и их не будут прямо избивать. И вот это, например, было при похоронах Навального. Мы же все-таки увидели, как люди пошли. Конечно, тоже можно было думать, что их будут разгонять и все, но все-таки вот это вот... И мы увидели, между прочим, еще одну важную вещь, что власть отступила в этот момент. Когда увидели, что сначала пыталась не допустить, но когда увидели, что все-таки так массово люди идут, и что их... А самое главное, что их поддерживают другие, может быть, они не против войны, но в этом гуманитарном, так сказать, посыле. Это вот в Белоруссии тоже очень понятно, что вот так вот уж прямо совсем, что это нашло поддержку такую довольно широкого круга людей, и власть отступила. Но вообще, конечно, если говорить о большинстве, что, безусловно, есть некоторое такое разрушение, это тоже делает диктатура, причинно-следственной связи. Когда люди, конечно, боятся, но они даже сами себе иногда не признаются, что эти страхи связаны с войной. Это очень интересный феномен. Они боятся, это показывают действительно левадовские опросы и все. Вот они боятся, например, повышения цен. И то, что экономическая ситуация будет хуже. Но сказать себе, что ведь это, ребята, потому, что мы начали эту войну, ведь это с этим связано, в этом люди признавать боятся. И вот этот вот такой разрыв, он очень удобен для пропаганды. Что это вдруг Курск? Что это там вдруг прилетело? Что это там прилетели эти дроны? Почему? Это, конечно, очень плохо, но тут мы-то тут при чем? И вот этот разрыв, он тоже очень характерен, потому что это тоже связано со страхом. Это тоже реакция такая, не признаться самим себе, где на самом деле причина. Ну и вот поэтому и все показывают, что боятся вроде как не войны. И, кстати, еще очень важная вещь. Никто не верит при всех этих страхах вообще о поражении России. Это тоже очень важно для людей. Что как-то что Россию может кто-то победить, что может быть какое-то поражение в войне, и вообще как это может быть. Вот это точно, так сказать, способствует тому, что эти страхи канализируются в какую-то, так сказать, другую сторону, экономическую и так далее. Спасибо.
Thank you. Andreas, Irina talked about sort of the predicates of fear in Russia. Now, you've already said that you think that German society would mobilize, right, if faced with what Ukrainians are facing. But at the moment, right, and we've talked about this again in various ways today, German politics on various levels seems to be paralyzed by fear, right? So fear of escalation and war in Europe, as well as fear of shifts in domestic politics, fear of the extreme right. And Germany, of course, is not the only country in this situation. Much of Europe and, frankly, the U.S. We're heading into. You may have heard there's an election, right, coming up, and we're afraid of what that might mean, as well. What does it take? What's the recipe for beginning to move beyond? Sergei has already given us part of the recipe, I think, to work with that fear for leaders, right? But it probably can't only come from the top. Is there the social infrastructure in Germany and Europe to begin to work more constructively with fear from the ground up?
Before maybe saying what needs to change, I want to propose my theory why the German position is here somewhat more problematic, let's say, than the French, American, or British position. And I think that has a lot to do maybe not so much with German interests. That is often in Ukraine suspected, that Germany has an interest in Russia, and that's where it comes from. I think that interest has simply gone down now. There's some residual interest. I also don't think that it has any more that much to do with German-Russian history. There is, of course, a very rich German-Russian history, not just in the 20th century, but earlier. But I would rather touch here upon a somewhat elusive topic of German irrationality and romanticism. So I think many people outside Germany don't know about that Germans have the reputation of being very rational and empirical and scientific and so on. And in the engineering and natural sciences, that is certainly true. But we have also a very deep-going irrational and romantic tradition. And I think that is something that is now being played with a lot. And maybe it's not and by accident that one of the, so to say, earlier capitals of German Romanticism, my hometown of Jena, is also the hometown of Sarah Wagenknecht, who is sort of playing in the most sophisticated way, perhaps, with these sort of irrational moments in the German psyche, where it's not important that Putin doesn't say he wants to conduct now any negotiations or that when he talks about negotiations, that what he's in fact talking about is a Ukrainian capitulation. What is important is that you believe in negotiations. You believe in the good. You believe in peace. The belief is important. It's something deep inside that has nothing to do with the empirical world. The empirical world, you know, is sort of, it's inside you. You come out of your values, you come to it. It's something that has to do with something very deep and psychological. And that is, I think, something that Sarah Wagenknecht plays a lot. And also the far right with. The other problem is, I think that that not only we know about this, but also the Russians know about this very well. So they have a long tradition of very good expertise on Germany. People like Falin, Portugalov. I've studied with Vyacheslav Dajicev, sort of intellectuals who have shaped this. And maybe it's not by accident that this sort of the capital of this pro-Russian discourse today is Dresden, where Putin lived for 5 years. And Dresden is I think, the capital in the sense not only that the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, and the Wagenknecht party or union, but also the Christian Democrats of all parties have overtaken basically this sort of pro-Russian position, and you have now a majority basically in Saxony, which was also, of course, I think the more important thing here that it is the former Valley of the Ignorant, as it was called in East Germany. That is because Saxony was geographically or geologically in a region which could not be reached by Western television. And my suspicion is that having not been reached for decades by West German television has now sort of caused this situation. And so we have a very, I think, irrational discussion about for instance, the nuclear issue. So somebody brought here up that, Russia could use a nuclear tactical weapon in Ukraine. I've talked to Ukrainian experts who would actually welcome that, because the use of a Russian tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine would change the war to such a degree that it would be actually, if you take the promises of NATO, of the US, of even Mr. Borrell seriously, who have announced that if a nuclear tactical weapon would be used, then NATO would wipe out the Russian troops on Ukrainian soil. So some of them calculating, well, then why not? Let them do that. We had already Chernobyl. We will also get over a second. I won't say here who said that, because it's a very tricky argument. But this is another rational argument about nuclear use has been now made by Mariana Bujerin, a nuclear historian at Harvard University, who wrote in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists that the actually empirical. Now we're talking about the real world again, and not something deep inside us. The only empirical use, the empirical example for usage of a nuclear weapon was not when a country was being defeated, but by a country that was on the offensive. And so she has calculated in this article that the likelihood that Russia would use a nuclear weapon when it would be winning in Ukraine is in her estimate higher than in a situation where it would be losing the war, because it would, like the US in 1945, trying to complete the victory over Ukraine by using the nuclear weapon. And we don't have these discussions here. We can't have them in Germany. This is something, what I'm saying now is here, like, we are for peace, we are for negotiations, and because we believe in the good, and what's happening out there in the empirical world is sort of secondary, because we have to have this sort of, we have our romantic view of the world. And the worst expression of this romanticization of politics is the current view that is still prevalent, and it's just ridiculous, about the 1970s so-called new Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt, which supposedly, in the view of many Germans, prepared the perestroika and the new thinking by Gorbachev. Because we had then this idea of a new Eastern policy, and we got together and we had these negotiations with the East German communists and the Russian communists, and then somehow this created then Gorbachev, and then perestroika came, and that was the end of the Cold War. And actually our policies ended the Cold War, because we were so smart already in the 1970s to have this new Ostpolitik, which is anti-empirical. The Soviets started developing the so-called Pioneer, it was called rocket, the SS-20, Sabre, I think it was called, during the new Ostpolitik. What came after the Ostpolitik was the SS-20 rockets, then the NATO reaction to it, the martial law in Poland, the invasion of Afghanistan, and almost World War III in 1983, when a low-ranking Soviet officer saved us from the nuclear Holocaust, right? That was the real history. But that's not important, because we believe that we did something good in the 1970s, and then perestroika in a magical way came out of it, and many still believe that, and we have to do that now for a second time. We did that already in the 1970s, and now we're going to save the world once more with our belief in the good, in negotiations, in peace, and so on. So that is, I think, what our main problems, and that is why the French have given Ukraine the Scalp, the Americans the ATACMS, the Brits the Storm Shadow, and the Taurus are still here in Germany.
Yeah. Hopefully that will provoke some questions, but I do want to come back to Jennifer. We've talked about fear as the enemy of resistance, right? As something that makes resistance difficult. But we've also talked about other things, belief being one of them, apathy being another. And I'm reminded, I think we've also mentioned Alexei Navalny a couple of times today. If I recall, the header on his website used to say that it was the finalная битва между добром и безразличием, right? Not between good and evil, but between good and apathy, right? Are we barking up the wrong tree here? Whether we're looking at Russian politics or at this war, or German politics or American politics, is fear not the problem? Is simply not caring the problem?
That's another good question. And I think apathy is a very tricky, it's an abstract term, right? It means in what context are we discussing apathy? If we, actually to underscore just what Andreas and what Irina said earlier, I think a bigger problem we're facing is a lack of knowing of history and a lack of just education in general. And if we put more emphasis on what has taken place over the last 30 years, I think perhaps apathy wouldn't even be a discussion. But in terms of in the context of Russia, again, just to underscore so much of what Irina was saying, I don't think we can say that there's been apathy per se with respect to what's going on. In some respects, you could argue, first of all, back to Navalny, your point, I think he very much, going back, was to make a statement that he wasn't afraid, right? I think that was a large part, and he's known to have read quite a bit about Soviet dissidents and how they talked about, don't fear fear. So I don't think that those could be viewed in apathy at all, or fighting apathy. And I think you could argue, actually, Putin's been very effective at marshaling both fear and apathy, right? By instilling fear for not just 2.5 years, but for much longer, over time, people's reaction has to be different than what a traditional resistance face would be. And I will say, last summer 2023, so I'm an anthropologist by training. I like going somewhere in the language and the culture, learning people's perspectives. And so I spent a month in Georgia doing research on a number of things, but I was very interested in the Russians who had come down. A lot, the Russians who migrated, right, went to Tbilisi or to Yerevan or former Soviet republics first. And I was astounded by the stories that people had, especially young people in their 20s, early 30s, giving these very detailed examples of what they had tried to do, but again, kind of the overwhelming, almost, bricks on them, continually being affronted in what they tried to achieve. And so, again, I don't think we can view that as apathy at any point, nor when they talked, I would say, importantly, about their colleagues who didn't leave. right? If we see it, it seems like, oh, it's somehow a blank face in Russia now. I don't think that's the case. I think it's people responding in different ways to the circumstances in which they find themselves. And I would just circle back again, I think the government, mentioning earlier government, Stalin, right, very effectively marshaling in conjunction fear and apathy and presuming at some point that that fear will result in apathy, but it's not actually apathy, it's a different way of dealing with it.
Thanks. I know this room is not apathetic or afraid, so please, let's take a round of questions.
Hello, thank you. Thank you all for the great insights. My name is Gabriela Swarovska. I'm independent expert based in Prague, and I am also part of the board of the Czech Green Party. And my question is on the fear, and some of you mentioned that people in Russia may not support the war, but they may think Russia cannot be defeated, and it's not exclusive for the people in Russia. People in the West think and have thought for a very long time that Russia cannot be defeated, and I think there was even some kind of a turmoil in the German security service because there were found and identified some twists in the reporting and analysis that didn't actually reflect reality in the Russian military. But my question is about something else. It's not maybe just the fact that people in the West and the decision makers think that Russia cannot be defeated. They may actually think Russia can be defeated, but the fear comes from the situation, and if Russia is defeated, what comes next? So actually the fear from the change and how we would react to the change. Would we be strong enough to steer the change the way we want? So isn't this also, the talks about, and Russia will, Russia will collapse, Russia will disintegrate. So I pose this question. It resembles me a little bit the situation, however counterintuitive the comparison is, with the Arab Spring. Actually, the fear of what if actually democratic forces win in the Middle East, we will lose control over the situation which we can steer through, cooperation with the dictators over there. So I would very much be interested in your insights on this.
Thank you. Over here I saw a hand.
Hello.
We'll see.
Barbara Freitag from Prague Civil Society Center. I would also very much like to go deeper on this issue on fear, because Franak mentioned how this moment can come when suddenly society is ready to go out of fear. You described it, how it happened, when the war started, basically the whole of Ukrainian society became civil, engaged society. Irina described how the moments emerged in Russia. I think Bolotnaya protests were probably the moment when we all felt it. And the image at the time was pasta vyshla iz tuby, as if fear was out and could not be put back into this tube again. It is now back in the tube, and my question really is, can it, in Belarus, in everywhere else, I believe that it can come out again, but isn't the situation in Russia very specific with the war situation, which has tied this leadership and regime together in a complicity of the whole society being involved? I mean, is the war changing the potential for fear ever going out of society?
No.
We'll take two more and then, yeah.
Я задам вопрос по-русски. Иван Асташин, участник правозащитной инициативы «Зона солидарности». У меня вопрос о связи страха, репрессий и медиа. Этот вопрос, который мы обсуждали с коллегой, главой первого отдела Дмитрием Заербеком. Как отмечала Ирина Scherbakova, сейчас нет таких массовых репрессий, как при Сталине, но сейчас есть медиа, и поэтому все репрессии тиражируются в медиа и доходят до всех слоев населения. И это создает страх. И с одной стороны, конечно, мы должны освещать репрессии, рассказывать о преследуемых, но с другой стороны, чем больше мы рассказываем, тем больше становится страха. И то же самое с пытками. Мы не можем промолчать, не рассказать о пытках, но когда мы рассказываем о пытках, это пугает людей.
Thanks. And there was a question over here. Yep.
Да, здравствуйте, меня зовут Иван Амелян, я представляю маленькую организацию, которая работает и помогает сообществам, группам, инициативам, которые остались в России и в Беларуси в том числе. И у меня есть маленькая ремарка по поводу resistance и вопрос на эту тему. Ремарка о том, что мы начали работать с российским гражданским обществом в 2022 году, после начала полномасштабной агрессии, и мы увидели, да, много страха, но сейчас он уходит в автоматизацию общества, и группы, которые находятся внутри, я буквально 3 дня назад встречался с людьми, которые приехали с 10 регионов России. Они говорят, ну, у нас страха нет, но у нас есть проблема с картинкой будущего. Мы не понимаем, каким оно будет. И я понял, что да, эта проблема очень, очень релевантна. И тут сразу же вопрос, наверное, скорее госпоже Ирине и также всем панелистам. Какой этой картинкой будущего России мы говорим? Потому что Украина показала, когда есть за что будущее, за которое нужно бороться, мы боремся. И для Украины это Европейский Союз, это безопасность в НАТО, это демократия, которой мы управляем как граждане, и это мирное существование со всеми вот, на данный момент. Почему я этот вопрос задаю? Потому что, да, я украинец, я не поддерживаю ту политику, которая сейчас там реализуется в Украине относительно будущего России. Как вы знаете, у нас очень мало официальных заявлений, но, допустим, в украинском парламенте сейчас есть закон о деколонизации России, который прямо говорит о том, что Россия не выживет как государство, и, по сути, в Украине создаются политики, направленные на дестрой России. Я хочу посмотреть, как член НАТО и Евросоюза будет сдерживать наплывы беженцев у себя на границе в условном 2030 году. С трудом это представляется. Поэтому для меня важен этот вопрос про картинку будущего и комментарий. Люди, с которыми я работаю внутри, они простраивают свою локальную картинку будущего. И в ней нет людей, которые сидят в этом зале. И это тоже большая проблема. В Беларуси, Франак, я думаю, прекрасно знает, тоже есть большая проблема тех, кто живет внутри, тех, кто выехал. И белорусы, я знаю, они очень классно придумали, как с этим работать. Диаспора много помогает людям внутри. Но мне кажется, эта проблема есть сейчас в российском обществе. Извините, что так много сказал, но спасибо.
Спасибо большое. A lot there to pick up on. So I'm going to take it back to the panel. I think we're just going to do this geographically. So Jennifer, we'll start with you and then work this way. Please, nobody needs to answer everything, but just answer whatever you are moved to respond to.
Maybe just a general comment. There was some, I think, most, the last comment question, but generally about the future, and I do think that is a problem. I think, talking with colleagues in the breaks, right, the past 2.5 years, certainly with, obviously, people who have left and who have fled, it's been, you have to deal with that immediacy first, and then it's developing a strategy for the future, right? And what is the future, not just for Russia, but for Belarus, for Ukraine, and for their relations with one another. And I think that is a problem. Getting back to the historical issue and like the lack of talking about history and education, how do we then jump to talking about the future? So I do think this is a collective problem, and I think in addition to dealing with the immediacy of the problem, dealing with however you want to term the Russian population that's living in Berlin or elsewhere, right? And if they're not going to go back, or if they are going to go back, how collectively are people going to move forward? And I think that's something, from the migration studies field, we always assume that forced displacement is going to be a short-term problem and it's going to be resolved in a year or 2 years. The reality is the average, displaced person, it can be 16 to 18 years. And we fail to start thinking in the early stages of what the future is going to look like. And so I think thinking now what the future is going to be while dealing with the immediacy of the problems needs to be done. And that actually then tying into the concept of fear, I think that will make fear less of something that we can't confront, and it's easier to confront it if you're already thinking about what the obstacles are going to be moving forward.
First about the war, I think Lukashenko is the biggest beneficiary of this war because this current status quo is helping him a lot, because he is keeping society in fear of the possible escalation. He gains a lot of money on selling arms, goods, details, bypassing sanctions to Russia. He understands that any change of the status quo can basically collapse the system because it's quite fragile. And right now he's praying, that there will not be, final peace talks, there will not be agreement, there will not be victory of Ukraine, because the current status quo keeping people in fear of possible war coming to Belarus. And this is the main narrative of the propaganda right now, that Lukashenko is the savior who helped Belarus to not get involved in war. Of course, it's a bullshit, but this works for majority of neutrals, of those who are don't have a very strong position. And we are trying to explain, and these flying Russian drones over Belarus, they help us to explain that Belarus is already dragged into the war. Because when you are in Minsk, you feel the war in Minsk much less than in Vilnius, where there is always explanation, media, the preparation, the defense of the border. In Minsk, there is the paradise island with no war. Wars are everywhere except Belarus and Lukashenko's paradise. Second question about the media. It's true that the regimes, Putin, Lukashenko, they are using our media, independent media, in order to spread the fear, strengthen this fear, because we focus a lot on human rights repression. We must do this. We must show the torture. We must explain what the regimes are doing. But in 2020, we had the balance with showing acts of solidarity, successes, victories of the society. Right now, we can't show many victories. We can't show many things happening inside the country because people will go immediately to jail, those who are active on the ground. And this make this repression the main focus of independent media, which basically stop many people from joining the protest. So I think what we can do more to make more stories of success, try to find positivity, not to undermine each other's work. This is very important in Belarusian society, probably in Russian democratic society too. Not to attack each other, but to try to praise, say thank to each other, to show what good was done, not only what was not done, because we know that we did not win yet. This is very important. And the third question was about the picture of the future. I think for Belarus it's very easy, to show this vision of Belarus, European democratic independence. It's very clear. It's what united people in 2020. But we also want our Western partners also to show this vision of the future. Because when people in surveys are answering the question, do you want Belarus to be part of the European Union? They explain, oh, it's unrealistic. And I think if the Ukraine will succeed on this Euro-Atlantic integration, Belarusians will, Moldovans as well, Belarusians will see that this is realistic. Because unfortunately right now, European integration and getting Belarus out of the Russian claws, it seems unrealistic for many. So that's important also for nomenclatura, because nomenclatura right now, mostly technocrats in Belarus, they are weighing who can give more, Lukashenko with Putin, and all this access to energy, gas, and etc., or let's say democratic forces, Tsikhanouskaya and the Europe. And right now they see much more tangible benefits, not all of them, but many, with this Russian cooperation. And we must show there is much more benefits, opportunities, free travel, visas, investments from the Western integration. And this is what we are trying to do as democratic forces every single day, to explain these benefits of Western integration for Belarus.
Thank you. Sergei.
Very briefly, greetings to the colleague from Prague, I assume. Yeah, you said that there is a fear which is widespread here about what will happen with Russia afterwards. You know, to be honest, I don't see that much this as a factor. But generally, the question is how to deal with this, the fear of the future and those fearful predictions that everyone is doing. You know, turn on at YouTube, you can hear it in Russian, you can hear it in German. I think our job is, at least from political perspective, is to work with goals and not with predictions. So what is our goal? What is, in fact, what is our picture? What do we envision of the future? And that should be what should be guided by us, not a fearful scenario of Russia's deintegration. This is, you know, we can do probability game, we can do lottery. We don't know how many factors will play into this, but the goal is, for example, that we have a democratic, free and non-imperial Russia, and if we put this as a goal, it doesn't mean that we will have probably a probability of 80% that this will be true, I think, but there is 5% that it could be the case. And for this 5%, we should prepare. That's why we should get the people out, we should support the opposition, we should create now already structures with those people who could be the actors in that beautiful Russia future, which with a probability of 5%. The second scenario is we prepare for a bad scenario, that Russia will not be beautiful in the future. And then we prepare for that by, for example, investing into our defense and what we're doing now. That's, I think, what should the conversation be, and not some very hypothetical predictions. We shouldn't even start playing this game that many want to play. Regarding the media, I wanted to thank you. And I understand how much of a dilemma it is for you, doing all the investigations, showing all these terrible things. For us, from the Western perspective, this is incredibly important because people, sometimes yes, and I think we should be thankful to you for doing this, because people, sometimes I think that the value of ignorance is still there. Many people here in Germany or in the West, they have no idea what happens in Russia, to what degree the torture happens there, and how dehumanizing the regime is. And every report like this helps us. It may be not motivating for Russians, but it helps the West to motivate us in their very clear assessment of the nature of this regime. So thanks for doing this. You are media and you're doing your job. That's great. And the final question regarding decolonization of Russia or not, I think we should not find colonization, we should find imperialism. And imperialism is a matter of head and not of territory. That's why I think that there are all these conferences that also some of them were organized in Brussels, how to disintegrate Russia. I don't think this should be our goal, but how to create an atmosphere where both the diasporas here, but also people and the minds in Russia start dealing self-reflectingly and in a way of self-criticism about the imperial tradition of Russian culture, Russian literature, how much things that are normal to the Russian population now are in fact discriminating and imperial vis-a-vis other minorities. This is what it should be about, but not trying to start cutting the map of Russia for the future. If it happens, it happens, but this should not be our main goal if we're talking about strategic goals.
Thank you. Irina.
Вообще-то я историк, а не футуролог. И надо сказать, что, в общем, все сейчас, к сожалению, это не означает, что не надо думать и готовиться к транзиту. Но, конечно, все наши, так сказать, сегодняшние представления, они очень-очень расплывчаты. И на самом деле вот то, что и делает ситуацию очень трудной и очень тяжелой и внутри, и снаружи, это то, что действительно будущее довольно-таки темно. Но, опять же, так сказать, с точки зрения историка, этот режим, он все-таки очень персоналистский. И вот эти все, так сказать, эти самые слова и заклинания Путиным, Путин — это Россия, и без Путина нет России, они дают на самом деле некоторую надежду. Простите, что я говорю такие совсем банальные вещи. Потому что это просто дает надежду, что если, так сказать, вообще-то с ним что-нибудь случится или, так сказать, ситуация, значит, так сказать, сдвинется, то это даст возможность свалить людям все на него. И это будет первый шаг, на самом деле. Простите, что я говорю такие довольно, может быть, цинично-реалистические вещи. Потому что, так сказать, что мы, и это в истории много раз проходили, это Сталин, а не мы, это Гитлер, а не мы. Мы вообще ничего такого не хотели, войны не хотели, мы вообще хорошие люди. Это очень, конечно, релятивистская, трусливая, мы говорим о страхе, трусливая позиция. Но это некоторое начало, возможное, простите, что я говорю такие, так сказать, неромантические вещи, но это некоторое начало для того, чтобы для какого-то мирного, я бы сказала, мирного перехода. И вот тут очень важны усилия разные по депутинизации и думать о том, что можно делать, какие пути, какие комиссии создавать, как должно работать международное сообщество, что надо доказывать, как людям объяснять. Это огромная машина, и это, так сказать, должна тогда включиться. И вот тут действительно эту как бы ответственность нужно будет разделять очень-очень многим группам людей, и политиков и так далее. Это будет очень большая задача. Но это, конечно, с моей точки зрения, все-таки довольно оптимистическая перспектива. Но я бы так сказала, что в истории, что режимы эти, они создают ведь тоже у людей ощущение вечности и незыблемости. И этому не надо поддаваться. Ведь очень много играет, ведь вот даже мы говорим ведь о страхе сегодня. Если бы мы не говорили о каких-то других вещах, там, значит, то это, может быть, звучало бы по-другому. Но страх — вещь такая, с которым надо бороться самым разным способом. И это может быть ответ на вопрос Барбары. Эти режимы внушают людям, что они будут вечно. Третий рейх будет вечно, так сказать, коммунизм будет вечен, Берлинская стена будет стоять вечно. Она была не выше 1,5 человеческого роста. Почему мы считали, и я во всяком случае так считала, что я не доживу до того, пока она будет сломана. А она, так сказать, открылась в один день. И мы в истории знаем такие примеры. Это не значит, что к этому не надо готовиться. Это совсем не означает большой работы и подготовки, но в этом есть некоторая надежда. Спасибо.
Thank you. I would note that Memorial, I think, just published or is in the process of publishing a program for the first 100 days after Putin. So very much worth reading. Andreas.
Yeah, I want to get back to this question about Russia falling apart or being decolonized. Obviously, the Ukrainians want the decolonization, a breaking apart of Russia. The question is, however, whether Ukraine can really achieve that. Yes, so they went into the Kursk Oblast, but I don't think they will be able to march into Moscow. In fact, if you look at how the Russian Empire was breaking apart before, it was in the connection of wars, you could argue, World War I and the Cold War, but it was not so much a direct result of these lost wars, but more a result of the pauperization, of the socioeconomic dislocations that these wars brought about. And the lost wars, without such domestic socioeconomic effects, like the Crimean War, the Russian-Japanese War, the Afghanistan War, war, they had rather good effects on Russian domestic affairs. The great reforms of Alexander II, the semi-constitutional regime after 1905, and Gorbachev's perestroika. So if you want to prevent disruption of and the falling apart of Russia, what you should be working against is a Russian socio-economic crisis. I think that would be then indeed not the Ukrainian parliament or somebody like that, which could indeed affect the falling apart of Russia if Russia cannot. I mean, some of the regions, most Russians wouldn't actually regret going away, like the Northern Caucasus. But so if you want to, again, if you come back to the rational strategy, you know, if you want to prevent this horrible scenario of Russian falling apart, the war should end, because now what we have, and maybe the economists here will correct me, an overheating of the Russian economy, and it seems that Russia is heading for a deep socio-economic crisis, which then could indeed create this risk. So what you want actually is a soon end to the war, perhaps with a Ukrainian victory, as we had with other wars, which then had good domestic results. And sometimes I even suspect when people say, as long as it takes, Ukraine will be supported. What is actually it? Yeah? Is it actually as long as the Russian economic dislocations will become so deep that Russia will finally fall apart? Is that the plan of this sort of as long as it takes? I mean, I think even if you have this fear of disruption of Russia, I think the best strategy would be to give the Ukrainians as many as possible weapons to have a quick victory, and then Russia can take care of itself and not longer create this artificial war economy that is apparently heading for as far as I read the economic commentaries, heading for a deep crisis.
Thank you. We've gone over time, but I think it was worth it. So thanks for the opportunity for the panel. Please join me in thanking Andreas, Irina, Sergei, Franak, and Jennifer. And thank you for your participation.
Thank you.